Hello, I'm Megan Selmer. I'm the Outreach Coordinator at the National Network for Equitable Library Service, also known as NNELS. Thank you so much for joining me today. Before I begin, I want to discuss a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and posted on the NNELS YouTube page. I will stop the recording before the questions and discussion period at the end. If you have any questions you would like to ask during the presentation, and you are welcome to, it will be recorded. Today's webinar, NNELS Demographics, Seniors with Print Disability, is all about how people read. People read in various ways and are comfortable with technology at different levels. Library staff assist diverse groups of people in accessing reading to suit their personal needs and preferences, including those with print disabilities. However, the increase in people with print disabilities and the aging population, along with everything else libraries are doing, can strain library resources and stretch staff thin. This webinar will build on the reference and readers advisory interviews to include seniors who are new to print disabilities. And I would just like to take the time to note that while I may not cover the extensive reading requirements of everyone in this cross-section of people, I'm here to help if you have any questions. Even if I don't have the answers, I'm going to do my best to find them for you. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Sililic Okanagan in Lekwungen, Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla peoples. If you would like to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge where you live, work, and play, you can do so now in the chat. Okay, let's start. What we're going to cover today. So first, we're going to begin with an overview of NNELS, and I'll just briefly talk about what we do and what we provide. Then I'll move on to a definition of print disabilities. I'll cover respectful language and interactions. And then I'm going to begin with some conversations with people with print disabilities. And this is all about, specifically in this demographic, finding asking your patrons the questions to determine if they have a print disability. Then I'll move on to personas and scenarios, and hopefully we'll have time for discussion at the end. So the National Network for Equitable Library Service, is also known as NNELS, is a digital catalog of accessible books for readers with print disabilities. NNELS support libraries in providing accessible and alternative formats for patrons with print disabilities. When I say accessible and alternate formats, what I mean is accessible formats are like mainstream formats that are made to be accessible, like MP3s and EPUBs. And alternate formats are specialized for persons with print disabilities, like DAISY 202 audio or BRF, which is Braille Ready files. NNELS readers can request books that are not yet available in accessible formats. We will find existing copies or produce new ones for them. We can provide this content and allow users with print disabilities to request titles under a copyright exemption provided by the Canadian Copyright Act in Section 32. NNELS is funded and supported by the provincial governments of British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Yukon, and the federal government. If you are in one of the funding provinces, your patrons and library staff, on behalf of your patrons with print disabilities, have free access to our services and request any books that they would like produced or added to our catalog. If you are not in a funding province or territory, your library staff and patrons with print disabilities can still use our services, but you cannot request books. Your patrons cannot request books, and you and library staff cannot request books on behalf of their patrons. So that's NNELS. Now let's talk about what is a print disability. From the Copyright Act, print disability is defined as a disability that prevents or inhibits a person from reading a literary, musical, artistic, or dramatic work in its original format, and includes such a disability resulting from A, a severe or total impairment of sight or the inability to focus or move one's eyes, B, the inability to hold or manipulate a book, and C, an impairment relating to comprehension. With this definition, it's important to consider that print disabilities can be permanent or temporary. For example, and I use this example often, If someone breaks their arm and they cannot hold a book for the duration of the healing, they have a temporary print disability. Print disabilities can be visible or invisible. For example, a person with a learning disability generally is an invisible disability. And print disabilities can be developed by anyone at any time in their life, medically, through an accident, aging, and more. Print disabilities encompass a broad range of people with disabilities, which is a good thing to remember when interacting with library patrons. A large portion of the Canadian population has a print disability. In the 2023 Statistics Canada survey, 5.2 million Canadians, or roughly 12.5% of the population, indicated difficulty with print material. So there are people with print disabilities in your community. When interacting with people with print disabilities or people with disabilities, I want to touch on respectful language and interactions. Please remember to consider the language you use when asking your questions. There are two types, person first and disability first. Person first emphasizes the person before their disability. For example, a person with a print disability. And you'll notice that's the language I use in this webinar. It is also the language that the Government of Canada uses. There's also disability first, which emphasizes a person's disability. For example, a dyslexic reader. There are people who prefer both languages. So we advise to ask each person what they prefer, but when in doubt, mirror how the individual refers to themselves. Seniors may not know they have a print disability, so this does not apply to all members of this demographic in this webinar. We also suggest you avoid using synonyms for the word disability or when referring to a specific disability. So let's talk about the questions you can ask in conversations about print disabilities. To access NNELS, patrons need to self-identify as having a print disability. Some individuals may not realize they have one. As we will cover later in the presentation, these questions are meant to uncover the main print disability, and in the next section, I will show some concrete examples. These questions will help clarify what print disability your patrons may have. Do you have trouble reading traditional print books? If yes, what troubles you when reading them? Then you could narrow down. For example, do you need to magnify the text or read large print books when you read? If yes, you could then follow up to determine if it is easier to read when changing a book font or increasing the space between the text, which would mean that reading systems that let users adjust the visual options are a good fit. Do you have difficulty holding a print book in your hands? If so, you could follow up to determine if the person can use a computer or mobile device, which would make them a good candidate to use ebooks. Do you have difficulty reading and comprehending the words of a print book? If yes, this may indicate a learning disability, and you could follow up with asking them what type of books or what font, for example, is easy to read. Then, and I'm sure everyone has asked these questions to patrons before, but it's good to note them here because how they read and the devices they have are really important to the reading systems we would recommend. So the next section is determining how your patrons with print disabilities would like to read. So the first question is, how would you like to read? And then you could follow up with, are you looking for an audiobook or an ebook? And then if they answer something like, I would like an audiobook, you can ask them if they prefer synthetic or human narration in their audiobooks. What do you use to read? Do you have a phone, tablet, iPad, computer, etc.? If they have a device, how comfortable are they with using it? So this would help us determine if they are comfortable enough that the reading systems that we would recommend are easy to use. If the library has X devices available, you could also ask them, would you like to learn how to use them? And then lastly, have you heard of or are you aware of assistive technologies? If no, explain that using assistive technologies may make reading easier for them to read, and ask, would you be interested in learning more about how? You could also add a conversation starter with your patron here on assistive technologies. For example, our large print collection is fairly limited. A tablet with magnification enabled using Libby may allow you to have more books available. Just to note, assistive technology refers to products, equipment, and systems that enhance reading, learning, working, and daily living for people with disabilities. This includes screen readers, magnification and enhancement software, refreshable braille displays, and more. Okay, now that we've covered some of the questions that you can start to ask your patrons, let's look at how we can utilize them in some personas and scenarios. So now we're going to discuss 3 personas and scenarios representing potential library patrons you may encounter. I've suggested some resources that may be helpful for you or the patron that you're helping to get them reading and using NNELS services. So the first persona is Nancy James. Nancy is an 87-year-old woman who enjoys reading, but her arthritis has worsened. And these days, printed text is getting more and more fuzzy. She can no longer hold a book or turn its page, but is unaware that she has a print disability. Nancy is looking for a simple way to read books without complicated devices that require steep learning curves. In Nancy's scenario, Nancy calls her local library to talk to a librarian. She wants to discover her reading options as she can't read print books anymore. Library staff ask her questions to determine how, what, and on which device she feels comfortable reading. And here are some questions you could ask Nancy. So firstly, what type of books would you like to read? Are you interested in reading audiobooks that play the book aloud? Have you ever used a tape or a CD player in your home or car? Do you still use it? This is like to determine what level of technology they have with something that they may be familiar with. If no, is it too complicated now? Are the buttons too difficult to see or push? Would you be open to trying a couple of devices available at the library? If no, there are options available for purchase would that be possible for your budget? Then finally, because she called, do you have a family member or who can load content, or can you come into the library when you have finished reading your audiobook? Here's a recap of Nancy's scenario and questions. Nancy does not want to learn to use a new device. She doesn't like pressing buttons, and most of the time she cannot see the label. Although she has some family nearby who could help occasionally, coming into the library would probably be easier. Nancy would likely benefit from a simple DAISY or MP3 player, and we have some resources to help you provide that for her. So here are some resources to help Nancy. These first resources are for library staff. So this is understanding the formats, the accessible and alternate formats that are available for your patrons. NNELS has an understanding format section where we lay out exactly what each format can provide to your patrons. And then CELA has a great webinar, What is an Accessible Book? Next up, what simple devices are available in the market that could work for Nancy? So CNIB and reading devices have DAISY players that actually can come loaded with audiobooks from CELA. Playaways are a great option. They have 4-ish buttons, and the age range on those devices are anywhere from, I believe, 6 and above. Canadian Assistive Technology is a great place to purchase assistive technologies. They also have senior fittings, which might work for Nancy. And then there are devices available from commercial sellers. So the iGornberg Dementia Music Player for elderly, memory loss, vision, and impaired patient has one button. You preload the audiobook on, and then you just hit the on-off switch. This was actually recommended by a librarian in the Kootenays who found it very helpful for one of their patrons. And Heal Value Fit, simple music player for the elderly, is another option with very minimal buttons to turn on and off the audiobooks. We would like to note that these devices are examples of something that could work for a patron like Nancy. However, they do cost money, and budgeting is often a serious consideration. And we just note that money can be an issue. And we understand that while these resources may help her, they may not be possible to purchase. Our next persona is Ed Norman. A 74-year-old Ed's eyesight has been declining over the last 4 years. He has some usable vision, but feels mostly comfortable reading larger print. He uses an iPad for his email and needs to zoom in as much as possible when he does. Ed is ready to explore reading digital books. In Ed's scenario, he enters the library to learn how to read a book on his iPad. He wants to read a large print mystery fiction novel, and although his local library has a great selection, it doesn't have the next book in a series he is reading. To read on his iPad, he needs to learn how to get to the NNELS website, find books, open and enlarge the text in reading systems, and request a title to get the content he wants. In this scenario, here are some questions you could ask Ed. Would you like to learn more about making the text larger on your iPad and other accessibility settings? Would you like to learn more about using your iPad, including apps, browsing the internet, and more? Here are some reading systems that the library recommends patrons enjoy. You could then show Ed Libby, NNELS, and other popular rating systems. And then, are these apps and websites something he would feel comfortable doing on his own after that mini tutorial? Would you like to learn more about finding, downloading, and opening NNELS content on your iPad? Here is a recap of Ed's scenario and questions. Ed is interested in exploring everything he can do and read with his iPad, including apps and internet browsing. He knows how to zoom in on his email using the pinching gesture, but is excited to learn more about the magnification software and visual adjustments that would help him read and use his device. Here are some resources to help Ed. So first, we start with the tutorial training and help documentation that exists on using the accessibility settings of different devices. Here are some options for multiple operating systems. So the first two, because Ed has an iPad, Apple Viz and Apple Accessibility Support would be Ed's best option. Apple Accessibility Support is from Apple and does have a great step-by-step tutorial on how to turn on software magnification from the accessibility settings. Apple Viz has a lot of really great tutorials written by people with print disabilities for people with print disabilities. And so we do recommend that. And then there's the Android Accessibility Overview by Google. That's really great if they have an Android device. Ability Net Fact Sheets is from the United Kingdom, and it has some really great fact sheets on different assistive technologies that includes the different devices. So for Ed, the magnification fact sheet from Ability Net would be good. And then CNIB has some iPad and iPhone training. So if he wants to get one-on-one help or in a group, that's a really great option as well. Next up are the digital literacy resources for seniors. So here are two options. The GLUE Society, which I may be pronouncing incorrectly, has a great digital literacy the topics covered are quite advanced. They talk about dark web, like how your data can end up on the dark web and phishing scams, but it's great for seniors. And then ABC Skills Hub has a lot of different options from work to lifestyle, but they're digital classes that are on specific topics. So they only cover one topic, would be really great for Ed in this scenario as well. So selecting the best reading system for Ed. NNELS has compiled a long list of reading systems for readers with print disabilities, noting their features, such as if visual adjustments are available. I've added the link to Accessible Libraries because it has summarized this lengthy list, because we do cover a lot of different reading systems and discuss which features are in each one. And for Ed, we would recommend the Voice Dream Reader from this list because he would like to read on an iPad. And here are some resources and tutorials for accessing NNELS content. So we have some great written documentation on the website about finding, searching, and downloading books to their device in our help tutorials. We also have an accessibility glossary of NNELS content and website YouTube playlist, which covers items like what is an EPUB and how to request a book, as well as how to change the contrast of the NNELS site, which Ed might appreciate. And then if he decides to, like if he's learned a little bit more about his iPad and wants to explore using iOS voice control, we have some great tutorials on that as well. All right, we're going to move on to our last persona. So Betty Garcia is a 68-year-old woman who became blind due to advanced age-related macular degeneration. She has been dealing with losing her vision for several years and is upset and struggling to come to terms with being blind and the associated grief that can come with vision loss. She still wants to read and needs to figure out how to do that among many other learning curves. Betty Garcia's scenario is next. Betty comes into the library to discuss how she can read library books now that she is blind. She is upset and annoyed that she must deal with this, but she wants to continue reading and is willing to learn about new technologies. Here are some questions you could ask Betty in this scenario. What devices do you use regularly? This would narrow down which assistive technologies she would be able to use. Would you be open to learning more about assistive technologies that would help you read on your device? You could then specify which assistive technologies. Would you be open to learning Braille? Would you be open to learning how to use a screen reader? And then depending on her answers, you could then focus on the assistive technology that she's most interested in. What type of book format are you interested in? Would you like to know more about reading audiobooks and daisy players? Or are you interested in using a screen reader or the read aloud function to read ebooks, for example, would both determine what kind of reading system we would recommend and the device. Here's a recap of Betty's scenario and questions. Betty uses a Windows computer and has an Android tablet. She would be open to learning more about using a screen reader on her tablet. She's unsure about learning Braille, but would like to learn how to use a screen reader and more about other resources available for people with print disabilities in Canada. So here are some of the resources to help Betty, part one. So information about the assistive technologies and learning how to read. So NNELS has an assistive technology comparison for screen readers, magnification, and Braille displays. And we bring together everything that's available at the time of that the table was compiled, and then note like the price and the difference and the operating systems that it works with. So there's that option. CELA has an accessible readings technologies webinar, which goes through different assistive technologies. CNIB has some technology programs that help train people in using assistive technologies. The Canadian Assistive Technology Training will train people in using assistive technologies. And Braille Literacy Canada has a great resource on learning Braille as an adult that if Betty was to become more interested in Braille, she could check out. Assistive technology demonstrations and tutorials. So navigating NNELS to find and download books with assistive technology is a great thing to go through. It's a print tutorial, and it just walks people through how to do all those actions using a screen reader on the site. And then Accessible Libraries has assistive technology comparisons. This might be more for library staff or people like Betty who are newly embracing assistive technologies. And it's just like a few demonstrations of how assistive technology works. We have screen readers, we have voice to text, and we have a really great Braille display demonstration, all of which I think you might be interested in. And then finally, for Betty, support for Canadians with print disabilities. So the Alliance for Equality of Blind Canadians Peer Support Program is a really great, it's a technology program for assistive, like learning about assistive technology, but it's also a peer support group. CNIB Live programs is one that may help her. And then the Canadian Council for the Blind GTT program, which brings together people with print disabilities to support each other. So in summary, print disabilities encompass a broad range of people with disabilities, which is important to remember when interacting with library patrons. Patrons with print disabilities have diverse reading needs. They read different formats on different devices at different skill levels. There is not a one-size-fits-all solution for any library patron. And serving people with print disabilities is like any reference or reader advisory interview. It's a conversation to find the best fit for the person at your desk. No one can ever have all the answers, but one of the best things about working in libraries is the huge network of professionals who can help. And that is hopefully where NNELS can come in to support you. Thank you for attending this webinar. I'm so glad you were able to join me today. If you have any questions, you can contact support@nels.ca, or if you have any questions for me, you can contact me directly at megan.selmer@bclibraries.coop.